This station and hundreds of other radio and TV stations throughout this part of the country are pooling their resources through an emergency network hookup to keep you informed of all developments. At this hour, we repeat, these are the facts as we know them. There is an epidemic of mass murder being committed by a virtual army of unidentified assassins.
Hello, Cassettes, and welcome back to the Black Case Diaries.
Hey! Hello!
We're three old friends learning everything we can about movies and TV, and hopefully teaching you in the process. I'm Marcy.
I'm Robin.
And Adam.
Hey.
Hey. Welcome back. So last week we started Frightening February with a horrifyingly historical episode on horror film history.
It was so scary.
Yeah.
I couldn't even finish it. I had to leave.
Well, this week we're continuing to look at how the genre evolved through the decades.
Yay! Adam, you're at least getting an appreciation of horror, right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay. Oh, we're
No,
doing
yeah,
this for nothing.
No.
Yeah.
No,
Man.
it's very cool, but I don't, I learning about something doesn't necessarily make me want to, dive in. But
There's some good ones I think you'd
Yeah.
like.
I'm sure there are.
Yeah. Art often imitates life, and vice versa. If there's anything we learned from last week, horror art is no exception. Follow these films, and you will find the history of our fears and how we responded to them. This week, we're starting in the 1950s, when the fears of communism, war, and radiation poison were ruling the lives of the American public. This week's discussion will stop at the end of the 1980s. But don't worry, after this month, we won't be closing the book on horror history forever.
No, of course not.
I mean, we really can't. It's just too packed full. You can't you can't even close it.
You can't. This is the suitcase you have to have someone sit on while you pack it.
So, snuggle up with a blanket and a bowl of popcorn. And just so you don't forget, it's only a podcast.
That's right. Don't forget. Don't get too scared.
Yeah. Last week, we ended our discussion in the 1940s, when vampires and werewolves were the least of the world's concerns. A Great Depression ended in a world war, bringing old fears from the Great War back into light. Hollywood took notes, and instead of trying to compete with the real-world horror of the atomic bomb and the Holocaust, they lightened up on horror films. But as the decade went on, new fears guided the pens of screenwriters and the lenses of directors, and the horror films of the 1950s were on the horizon.
Oh yeah, it couldn't last forever.
Nope.
Couldn't last forever all that time of not scaring people.
Yep.
Why not, though?
All of the campy, That stuff is pretty delightful. You'll find most of it on, Mystery Science Theater.
Right, where they're
Beautiful.
you go into it knowing this movie's not great, so we're just gonna make jokes about it.
Yeah, the entire time. Although the Second World War appeared to be over, it left some nasty scars. After America caused devastation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the threat of the atom bomb and the effects of radiation started to manifest at the local cinema. I think a lot of this had to do, too, with the testing site. And people, all the witnesses from when they tested the atomic bomb as well, kind of really added a lot of the fear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This led to films about giant monsters, huge insects, large people, and even gelatinous blobs.
Whoa.
Oh, man.
Though I believe the gelatinous blob was something from outer space, just in case.
I mean, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
The truth was, audiences were no longer interested in horror that took place in far-off and non-existent lands. They wanted to be shown the dangers of their own society. Why? We'll never know.
Yeah, I don't get it.
So the movies of the 1950s delivered, but instead of giving audiences terrifying realism, they comically exaggerated the common fears of the American people. This was a time period where horror fell further out of the mainstream and into B-movie territory. The plot seemed silly, but the scares were real. The stars of these films weren't considered for the A-list, and you wouldn't see a movie like The Blob on the Oscar shortlist.
What? You
Come
wouldn't?
on.
Yes, the I found out about the Blob because of the movie Grease.
Oh,
yeah.
When they go to the drive-in, they're
What
watching the trailer for it.
Oh my gosh.
Every one of you watching this screen, look out. Because soon, very soon, the most horrifying monster menace ever conceived will be oozing into this theater.
Beautiful.
How do you come up with something like that? I mean, I get the atomic nature of monsters and all that stuff,
Yeah.
but literally like evil flubber. You know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about? So it's like, how does that happen?
Evil flubber.
Also in the 1950s, theaters started employing gimmicks to get people to pay the price of admission. One of these was 3D viewing, which was really popular with horror audiences.
Ooh.
Oh.
So in the 40s, television became a thing.
Hmm.
And because of that, actually, people going to the theaters, audiences depleted by almost 50%.
I believe
Wow.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, so people stopped going to the movies when TV became a thing, which is kind of what's happening right now, sort of.
Yeah.
In a new way.
Yeah, it's like a whole different, it's a whole different example of it.
Yeah.
The principle is almost exactly the same though, because it's like, why go to the theater when I can do it at home?
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
The difference
yeah.
is just it being broadcast versus streamed over the internet.
Yes.
Yeah.
But no matter how popular or unpopular the genre was, it always served its most loyal fan base, the outcasts. It was the people that didn't fit in that flocked to the theaters to watch the lives of on-screen conformists get ripped apart by hideous monsters.
I just
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, you're that kid that gets made fun of in school, right?
Mhm.
And you go to the movie theater and you see the jock get killed by an alien, and you're kind of like, ha! It's like, I mean,
with my superior intellect, I would have seen the alien coming. What a fool.
monster movies didn't just come from fears of radiation poisoning. In 1952, courts ruled that films were free speech, and censorship from local and state committees ceased. Seriously, please listen to our MPAA episode. If you have not listened to that episode yet, we talk about that
Yes.
there.
Yes.
This was incredible news for horror, as monsters could run amok on screen once more. So finally, they could actually make monsters in the
Yes.
1950s, and that's why monster movies became a thing.
Yes.
Right.
You didn't have to kill them off.
Yes, yes, they could win at the
They could
end.
Yeah.
They could, heaven forbid, that the monsters win, that the characters learn a lesson. Imagine.
What?
Wow.
Morals? Nonsense.
In Japan, filmmakers harnessed the destructive power of radiation and created the king of 1950s monster movies, Godzilla. Go listen to that episode, please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great. With
It's an older one.
Yeah, older
Yeah.
one with the special
Yeah,
things.
so the sound is probably different,
It's fine.
but it's good enough.
It's good.
The atom bomb also forced Americans to consider the possibility of the end of days and what kind of world humans would leave behind. The 1955 film The Day the World Ended was the first to address this existential question. And stories concerning the end of mankind would carry over into the next decade.
That's something that I think is carried on forever.
Yeah.
Like since, you know what I mean? Like every once in a while we still get those like huge disaster movies.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
sometimes they're like, oh, this is what? Come on.
Yes, The Day After Tomorrow.
Yeah, or there was
Mhm.
that one that was like, I think it was called like Geostorm or something
Oh
like
my
that.
gosh.
Do you remember that? It's like,
Yes.
I mean, it's just another one of these big disaster
Mhm.
movies
Yeah.
where everything is going wrong, right? But it's just
Mhm.
like, it's a little campy.
Yeah. Americans, and the world for that matter, had been trained to watch the skies for signs of attack. A current arms race and Cold War with the Soviet Union only heightened the fear that something would be coming from above. In 1947, there was a mysterious crash in Roswell, New Mexico. A local rancher gathered the debris from the site, which was then seized by the government. A press release referred to the downed object as a flying saucer, and a later press release corrected that statement to say it was a weather balloon.
Yeah, right.
Who believes that?
Oh, gosh. It's well known that humans fear the unfamiliar, and nothing was more alien than, well, aliens from outer space. Of course, the fear of an alien invasion was not new in the 1950s, hence the infamous War of the Worlds broadcast in the 1930s. But it was clear that this fear had returned and wasn't going anywhere. So, spacemen were a popular subject matter in many 1950s sci-fi horror films.
Yes, it came from outer space to fill the world with terror, to bring you unforgettable suspense.
They're so cool. It's
Yeah.
I guess this is one piece of horror that maybe I'd be all right. Because I find aliens, or the concept of aliens, very fascinating, and I like space and science.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So here's the conspiracy for you guys.
Mm.
All of these are, aliens put into the mainstream. All these movies were getting made, and so that we would get used to the idea of aliens, right?
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
So that when the government finally tells us that, yes, aliens exist, we're like, all right.
I don't think they even have to tell us anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
I feel
True.
like now they would, and we'd be like, duh.
We
Yeah.
knew that already.
We figured that out a while ago. Come
See,
on.
it's all part of the plan.
Yeah.
In the early 1950s, aliens were depicted as a terrifying threat. The Thing from Another World in 1951 was an example. John Carpenter, who would remake the film in 1982, was drawn to the ending and how they destroyed the creature with flame. Another example came in 1953, when aliens appeared on screen in H.G. Wells' sci-fi classic War of the Worlds. So it's interesting because, we're talking about how horror movies kind of reflect some of the issues of the time, and
Mm-hmm.
the 50s, there is a level of xenophobia, a level of racism, just kind of like, they're different. We shall kill them,
Yeah.
you know what I
Right.
mean?
Yep.
Though in a lot of these, it's like, obviously they're a threat and then they're killed,
Yeah.
but it's still there. Like, it's kind of lurking there in the underbelly of the
Mhm.
movie, It's like,
Yeah.
Yeah, because you could always say, like, well, what if
yeah.
we just, like...
Yeah, there's two sides to this story, and
Right.
we're only
Mhm.
seeing the movie from one person's perspective.
Mhm.
And if we've learned anything from the cabinet of Dr. Caligari,
Mhm.
Yeah.
or Caligari, however you say that name, but calamari.
Mm.
Delicious.
Yes. If we've learned anything from that, we know that, just because we're being told one side of the story doesn't mean that's actually the truth.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's something we can always question in horror. These films enhance the mentality that we should destroy that which is different. It was much more popular for film aliens to be invaders, not lost species looking for a way home. Sure, a great big monster with several eyes and sharp teeth seems pretty scary. But do you know what's even scarier? The monsters that we can't see. After a depression and a war, Americans were desperately afraid of losing the picturesque ideals they had been promised. They were terrified of losing the American dream, and in that sense, nothing was a greater threat than communism.
Duh.
we all have these ideas of what the past was like,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
and most of those ideas are wrong. It's kind of like how we were saying last week, how we thought that the 20s were probably like kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
because
Right, yeah.
The nation was technically prosperous, and
Yeah,
but
yeah,
really
but
everybody was
really-
reeling from a horrific war, and
Mhm.
everyone was just dancing because they didn't have anything else they could do, and
Yeah.
Right.
in the 1950s, this is one of those time periods where everybody wanted everything to seem perfect,
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
because nothing had ever been perfect before.
No.
But suddenly there was this ideal that everybody needed a house, everybody needed 2 kids, everybody
Yep.
need,
A
and it
white
was,
picket fence.
yeah, it was this weird, women didn't really work. So, yeah, this is an interesting time period,
Mhm.
the 1950s. The Red Scare instilled the fear of invaders, posing as regular folks, living in the same pink houses as they did, sitting ticky-tacky all in a row. By the mid and late 1950s, films started utilizing this concept. Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956 masterfully combined the dangers of mob mentality with the fear of alien takeover, all while serving as a metaphor for the Red Scare. A lot in one movie.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
Oh man, yeah.
They look like us. They talk like us. They could be us.
Oh, no. They could be you or me or the cat, even. You don't know.
Who knows?
Yeah. These fears penetrated the perfect society that Americans wanted to believe in, exposing the darkness that lay beneath the apple pie and lemonade.
Bob Dylan said it best when he sang, "The times, they are a-changin'." And boy, was there a lot of change in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Every decade brought about its own shifts in technology or world events, but the 1960s were all about reform. Of course, this meant the movies changed as well.
Mm-hmm.
The 1960s were marked by the civil rights movement, sexual revolution, violence, and anti-war protests, especially against Vietnam. We mentioned that the death of the Hollywood production code meant less censorship in the 1950s, but the effects really started to show in the 1960s. In the Supreme Court case of Joseph Burston Incorporated versus Wilson in 1952, it was found that a movie could not be banned because it was deemed sacrilegious. It was declared that expression by means of motion pictures is included within the free speech and free press guarantee of the First and 14th Amendments. By 1968, the Hollywood production code was completely abandoned, which allowed filmmakers to really explore taboo topics like sex and violence. Horror started by challenging social norms, and it could finally return to its roots.
Yeah.
Suck
Woo.
it, code.
Heck yeah.
You suck.
Throughout the 60s, there was a lot of violence politically. JFK got assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
I believe his brother Robert got assassinated in the 1960s as well.
Oh my.
So did Martin Luther King Jr.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of assassinations, and you had the whole counterculture being born in California, down in Haight-Ashbury, and the hippie movement. It was a time, you know. There were parts of it that seemed, there were parts of it that seemed kind of innocent, almost,
Mhm.
you know, because there were some very much like, we want love, not war, we want peace, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there were a lot of really intense, horrible things that were also going
Yeah.
on.
At
And
the same time, yeah.
at the same time, America got involved in Vietnam.
Yep.
So,
Much like 3D of the 1950s, early 1960s horror also featured the gimmicks of William Castle. He issued special glasses to viewers of his 13 Ghosts, which he called Illusiono in 1960.
Wow.
so they had filters on. I think this is so funny. They had filters on the glasses so that you could see ghosts in the movie that you wouldn't see without the glasses.
Wow, that's kind of
That's
cool.
pretty
Yeah,
honestly.
It's super cool. They had to do this stuff to get people to go see the movies because, like
Yeah.
we said, they're all cozy at home.
Yep.
I mean, I would do that.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool.
I would go see a
Yeah.
movie twice.
Yeah,
One
I
of
think
this
they
and
should
one
bring
of
back
that.
Illusiono. I like that idea.
Yeah.
You'll be scared stiff too when you see what they see. 13 ghosts materializing in ectoplasmic color through the magic of Illusiono, the ghost viewer.
In 1959, he installed something called Percepto in his theater for the showing of a film called The Tingler.
I think I might spit that movie out.
It just sounds wrong, doesn't it?
It does. It just sounds wrong. I don't understand. Like, I don't know what it sounds like, but it just sounds
doesn't.
weird.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to. I don't want to be touched by this movie,
Yeah.
so I'm not gonna
Oh,
go.
but yeah,
Yeah.
get ready because random theater seats were set up to charge
No.
with electricity to simulate audience panic during the
Yep.
film.
So you would go in and you could sit in one of the seats that are charged.
No, get out of town.
And it would just like shake the seat or whatever.
No,
yeah.
thank you. I'd rather do smell-o-vision.
The tingler was in the room with you.
Oh, no,
Lord.
don't say it like that.
I don't like that.
Me neither.
Back in the 1940s, noir thrillers were quite popular. One filmmaker, Val Lewton, created films that walked the line between a noir thriller and a horror film. Supernatural creatures with human situations. Psychological thrillers didn't make it in the 1950s against the creature features and gimmicks. But in the 1960s, a filmmaker emerged that brought this type of scare back to the cinema and changed modern horror forever.
I wonder who it was.
Oh man, that's really...
I'm really
Oh.
yeah. So like noir thrillers, so it's kind of like the detective movies,
Yeah.
but it's monsters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's, it walks the line. I was reading the difference between a thriller and a chiller.
Yeah.
A thriller is a movie that is based in our reality, the one that we exist in right now and things that we know to be real. And a chiller is one that
On
has
ice?
supernatural.
Wait.
That's it. It's a thriller on ice. Isn't it a
I knew it! The chiller is...
A chiller is one that has monsters in it, something supernatural
Interesting.
that we don't know to
Ah.
exist in our
Gotcha.
world.
So it's
And-
you
Yeah,
get
so
a
his
chills to the
movies
bone.
walked that line. They were supernatural in the sense that there were monsters, but it was a thriller in the sense that it was a very real human experience that was going on.
Yeah. It's impossible to talk about 1960s film without mentioning Alfred Hitchcock.
Hey.
Yeah, there we go.
That's who it
There's
is.
his name. While movie restrictions faded, filmmakers became bolder and began seeing how far they could push the limits. And Hitchcock was no exception. His movie Psycho from 1960 would change the genre and film forever.
I think that we're all in our private traps, clamped in them. And none of us can ever get out.
The film was based on a novel of the same name by Robert Bloch. After Hitchcock bought the film rights, he famously bought as many copies of the book as possible to prevent people from reading it and learning the ending.
What?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yes.
weird.
Yeah.
I guess I get it. It's kind of interesting.
Isn't that odd? Isn't that weird? Imagine living in a time where all you had to do was buy up the books.
Yeah. Insane.
Definitely impossible now.
Yeah.
But this ensured his film was going to be as shocking as possible.
It was a movie shrouded in secrecy.
Yes.
People had no idea what they were coming into when they went to
Wow.
go see it. And I just wish I could have that experience.
Yeah.
I wish I could go see this movie and not know what's going to happen. Because
Yeah.
it's just so, to us, it seems all very predictable because we all know all the twists and turns.
Yeah.
But if you look at it from their perspective, this was very different.
Yeah. Before Psycho, the majority of horror focused on gothic romances. Psycho would bring in ideas that are closer to the horror that we have today. It displayed sexuality, depicting a woman in her undergarments, implying that she had sex outside of marriage.
I know.
Oh, man. TV shows were still showing married couples sleeping in separate beds at this time.
I always thought that was the weirdest thing. Growing up, my parents always slept in the same bed. I was
Exactly.
like, that's
Yeah.
what couples do. That's what parents do. And then you watch on TV and they're in separate ass beds. I'm like,
Yeah.
what's going on?
That doesn't make any
Do
sense.
they
Yeah,
do
it
they
doesn't.
hate each other? Like I was always like, are they want a divorce real bad, but they can't because of their
It's
kids
the
or something?
50s. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I never got it.
Well, yeah, it was really just because of TV code.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
That was the only
All
reason.
because of TV.
Man.
Can't assume the Cleavers are having sex because, Wally and Beaver must be adopted or something. You know,
Right.
'cause
The
we-
only other option.
Yeah.
Although there is some debate about whether it was the first American film to show a flushing toilet, it was still groundbreaking for doing so.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a nice stat.
Yeah.
yeah, so some people argue that there are older movies that show toilets or have the flushing sound effect. That was the big
Yeah.
thing that people thought was groundbreaking. You could hear someone flush a toilet, and it's a woman flushing a toilet.
The shower scene showed that nobody was safe, even someone who had more screen time at that point in the film than any other character. It also played on audience expectations with a twist, showing that even the most ordinary of people could be diabolical. We can even thank Hitchcock for having set movie times. Since Psycho was so dependent on being seen from beginning to end, Hitchcock was insistent that nobody be permitted into the theater after it began. At the time, it was common practice that the movies would be on a sort of loop, and you would walk in whenever and finish the movie and then stay to watch what you had missed in the beginning. If Psycho had been seen that way, the ending would ruin the effect of the beginning.
That's pretty wild.
I kind of want that back. Can we have that back?
I know.
Like just looping movies.
Yeah, it's like if you're late, like you just hang out and then
Yeah.
you see the beginning.
We kind of get that with our drive-in.
Yeah, the
movie
drive-in
theater.
theater does that.
They
Oh,
do
true,
that.
because they'll show the first movie again.
Yeah.
3 years later, Hitchcock continued to push the boundaries of what audiences were willing to watch with The Birds. This film was also psychological, but it shook audiences with a new kind of movie villain that they never would have been able to control: nature. The most disturbing part of the film is that there's no explanation for the attacks, showing that the characters live at the complete mercy of the beasts.
Yeah.
Done.
They never
Dun.
truly defeat the birds.
No.
The birds just stop attacking.
Yeah.
Wild.
And then they drive away. And that's the end of the movie.
Yeah.
And it's just, I remember just how uneasy this movie made me feel because I
Yeah.
watched this as a kid.
Mm.
And it made me a little afraid of birds, actually. I was kind of scared of them.
Mm-hmm.
Since these two movies were such big hits and pushed the limits on what crowds were willing to see, many other filmmakers tried to upstage them by creating bigger shocks or more violence. One director, Herschel Gordon Lewis, took this direction so far that he is responsible for a horror subgenre known as splatter.
Oh, we don't have to define that now, do we?
Oh,
Yeah,
boy.
I feel like you could just get that.
Yeah, you got it.
Oh.
These films focus on graphic portrayals of blood, as the name suggests.
Fun.
Yay! In the 1960s, ghost stories were another form of horror on the big screen. Another monster that falls into the psychological category. Some films never explicitly state whether the journeys of the protagonists are real or not, but their survival usually hinges on their recognition of what's happening and their mental state. These films were often featured female protagonists. At this point, it was popular to show a beautiful woman in terror or agony in horror films. You could argue this was popular as early as the 1920s, but Alfred Hitchcock is credited with making this a prominent trope.
Yeah. The beautiful woman
Yeah.
in pain, danger. But we think back to Nosferatu, Woman in Danger. You think back to Warning Shadows, that 1920s movie is very similar to these ghost type movies that seemed to be warning women of something.
Yeah.
I think of King Kong, too.
Oh.
Yeah.
Another product of the psychological thriller era was Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. Many episodes of the classic show preyed on abstract fears of its audience, like loneliness and the capability of men turning on each other.
Yeah. There's an episode in the first season. It's all of this. It's so much. It's called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and it's this.
Ah.
It's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of intruders, not trusting each other. It's about like all of that stuff. It's very psychological.
It's that your own imagination makes up the worst stuff, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, they know that someone among them
Yeah.
is probably an alien, and they just don't know who it
They don't
is.
know. Due to its B-movie status in the 1950s, there weren't a lot of well-known actors that were considered horror stars. In the 1960s, Vincent Price was possibly the most popular horror actor. Vincent Price has been known and remembered for his work in horror films, even though this made up a small portion of the films that he starred in. Some of his most well-known are The Last Man on Earth and The Tingler, which we mentioned earlier.
It's back.
His distinctive voice and ability to bring an unsettling presence to the screen left a mark on horror fans everywhere.
Do you think he got one of the rigged seats at the premiere? I feel like he'd be like, I shouldn't have one of these seats.
Yeah.
I'm gonna switch, please.
The late 1960s is still known as one of the most tumultuous times in American history. It was filled with violence and fear, along with a rise in counterculture. Now that films could show blood, filmmakers didn't hold back. They used the medium to spread messages to their audiences. Looking through the horror films of each decade, you can see the warnings that filmmakers desperately wanted to express. From environmentalism to racism to xenophobia to war.
You can see even in The Birds, you feel like there's a little bit of an environmental message here. Even if it's not, no one's explicitly stating it. The things were a little more subtle back then.
Right.
Yeah.
But, just nothing very explicit, but just kind of, these we're at the mercy of the world. No matter how powerful we think we are, no matter how many weapons we have.
Yeah.
Humans are not really in control.
And I think it would have been less impactful if you can imagine them being like, oh, well, if we would just stop driving cars around, the birds will stop attacking us.
If we would just stop polluting.
Yeah. George Romero was one of the most influential horror filmmakers of all time, and is fondly known as the father of the zombie film. Although his 1968 film, Night of the Living Dead, was not technically the first zombie movie, it is the most influential in what would become a zombie trend and set most of the lore that is held behind them. George Romero was a big fan of making statements within his works. However, one that he didn't mean to tackle was the problem of racism in America. In the documentary Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, he says, "Why do you do horror? Well, you do it to upset the uppercut. But in the end, it kind of gets set back up again. We kill the monster. And I didn't want to do that." In order to accomplish not killing the monster, Romero, spoilers, instead kills the main character, who happens to be a black man. No, yeah, so he doesn't kill the zombie. He doesn't kill the monster. He kills the man.
Yeah, he cast a black man as the main character of his movie, and then he survives all the way through the movie, which is already flipping a trope that you'll hear.
Yeah.
People will say, well, the black guy's gonna die first. He has this character survive all the way through the movie.
Yeah.
And then for him to get senselessly killed just at the end.
At the end, yep. By other people.
By other people who think he's a zombie.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, the message is so clear we don't have to spell it out.
Yeah.
For you.
Right.
Yeah. No.
And I love that. I love it. So it's so strong. But he's like, "Oh, I didn't mean to do that."
Yeah.
We're all like, "You didn't."
Are you sure?
Even the actor who played him was like, "No, I thought it was like this the entire time. I read the script or whatever, and I saw this character as symbolism."
I totally got the symbolism. And George Moreau's like, oh, sure.
I just thought you were a great actor, and I put you in the role,
I
but
just put
okay.
you in the movie. It reminds me of doing critique. We would do photo critique, and and sometimes someone who's critiquing you sees something in your art that you did not put there.
Yeah,
and they're like, I love what you've done with this and the symbolism of that, and you have that internal struggle. Do I claim that? Do I act like I did that on purpose? Or do I tell the truth,
Yeah.
All right, so we got to the end of the 1960s.
Nice.
So let's talk about the 1970s.
Yeah.
It's safe to say the horror genre only got bloodier as it ventured in the 1970s.
Oh, man.
Yep. Filmmakers built on the fundamentals of horror that had already been created, mixing psychology with gore, using horror to send a message or to express themselves. In terms of history, the 1970s seemed to be a more mature 1960s, building on the pain and turmoil of the previous decade. The violence in Vietnam continued on, as did the sexual politics of the time. So we'll talk a little bit more about sex in the 1970s. There was a little bit of it. We saw a little bit of it in Alfred Hitchcock, and there's a little bit more of sexual freedom for women, showing them in bras, showing them having sex out of wedlock. Some films still focus on the topical issue of war, like Death Dream in 1974. This film follows a soldier that was presumed dead as he returns home from war and starts to exhibit strange behaviors.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that you could shake off,
Yeah,
so...
right. George Romero sure did start a trend with his flesh eaters. Audiences gobbled up zombie films as more and more were produced. Copycat zombie movies took over an entire section of horror. Over the years, many more continue to be added, with many of the same rules that began with Night of the Living Dead. The major contributing factor in this is surprisingly a lapse in copyright. Originally, the movie was to be called Night of the Flesh Eaters. When the title was changed, the distributor failed to put the copyright on the final print, and it entered into the public domain.
Oh, son of a gun.
Yeah.
This unfortunate accident would be, in the end, a happy one, for it has grown the zombie horror genre exponentially.
Oh, man,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's so many, not just movies, but like any person who's into video games too will to say that there are so many zombie games.
Yeah. I would say that if this didn't happen, it would be like George Romero didn't get to create the zombie.
Yeah.
Because it would be copyrighted. All of the things that the rules that he created about zombies, all of that would have been copyrighted. And there wouldn't be zombie movies now that have those same parameters.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe there would be new ideas, but this version would be just in this movie.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and it seems like he didn't care that much. He didn't get a lot of money because of this, right?
Yeah, he was got
Bummer.
practically nothing. The distributor who made the mistake got paid a whole bunch,
Whoa.
but
of course,
he did not.
George Romero, the filmmaker, didn't make any money.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good thing he was a good guy, huh?
Yep.
As the war in Vietnam raged on, Americans felt divided. It was a type of class warfare in the States. Rich versus poor, young versus old, us versus them mentality. Larry Cohen's film, It's Alive, focused on the alienation that parents felt from their children. What happens when you're afraid of the thing you love most? This also perpetuated the keep it in the family concept of horror films, where the family's secrets are best kept as secrets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And,
I immediately think of Get Out.
Ah.
The one that I most recently think of. Obviously, some family secrets that are no good.
Yeah, they don't want those getting out, for sure.
Nope.
Nope.
As horror films included more sex and violence, they became known as savage cinema. Films like The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes used graphic violence in a meaningful way. They depicted horrific acts that should insult viewers to great effect.
To avoid fainting, keep repeating to yourself, it's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie. Last House on the Left.
Films often justify revenge violence, but this film promoted the message that violence is always ugly. The protagonists act just as violently as the antagonists, and it does not undo the harm that the antagonist caused to begin with.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
How many movies glorify revenge?
Mhm.
Oh, so many.
It's satisfying sometimes.
Yes, I like that these exist. I like that
Yes.
there are movies that people watch and they go, oh my God.
Mhm.
Because the whole time you have that feeling of, oh, you better kill him like they killed your family.
Yeah.
But then at the end, it's like, oh yeah, that did nothing.
Yeah.
All
My-
that did was just end more life.
Yeah. My
Yeah.
family is still dead. I
Yeah.
don't feel any better.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's no, it's not satisfying.
Yeah.
One of the most iconic of these films is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. Many horror films begin with a sense of calm to lure in the viewer and make them feel comfortable before traumatizing them. Texas Chainsaw Massacre did no such thing. This film told audiences what it was from the very beginning by bringing them to a world unafraid of gore. This film gave audiences the sense that there was something wrong with America. Yeah. This movie starts out with, like, dead animals.
Yeah.
All kinds of stuff. Yeah. Rotting flesh and
It's
things.
not pretty.
Yeah, so this is not something that, when it started, people knew what they were getting into.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh my.
You knew right away,
Mhm.
yeah, I need to leave the theater. Much like in the 1950s, the 1970s horror still had roots in the American dream. Films like The Stepford Wives created a reality where that dream was manufactured, turning something that Americans strive toward into a nightmare. The Exorcist was a film that traumatized audiences by letting them connect with the lives of the classic American family. Nothing is more precious than a young child, and watching a demon destroy the dreams of law-abiding American family filled audiences with dread.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness.
Yeah, this is a movie that people around me are like, this is one of my favorite horror movies. And I'm like, no, I don't want to watch it.
That's one that I don't think I'll ever watch.
Mm.
Me
Mostly
neither.
because I'm afraid of the devil.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Like, it's hard. Like, I'm actually afraid of it, so I don't want... I just don't even want to watch.
when it pushes the particular button
Yeah.
of you that it's like, that's the one thing that I'm kind of legitimately scared about.
Yeah.
Then it's okay.
Dude, I wouldn't even touch a Ouija board.
Yeah. No.
No.
Oh,
No,
God.
no, no,
No,
no.
no,
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 no.
no, no. Since sex was previously a taboo subject, the 1970s tackled it with reckless abandon.
Hilarious.
The proposal of the Equal Rights Amendment ignited conversations about sex, and women were becoming more powerful on screen. Like
Woo.
Carrie, for example, right?
Yes.
Gosh,
Oh,
I
that's
hope women
right.
don't get
Oh.
too powerful.
Yeah.
And they'll get telekinetic powers and kill
Kill
everybody.
everybody.
Before you know it, they'll be able to vote.
Just 10 years before, women were often the victims, and now they could be the heroes or the antagonists. They could be anyone. Sexual liberation was a prominent theme in the film Shivers in 1975, where a group of people spread parasites through sexual contact. The parasites make them essentially sex zombies. Definitely something new for major motion pictures.
What the absolute hell
We're
is
gonna have to
a
watch this one, right,
sex
guys?
Yeah.
zombie?
This one's on the list.
Yeah, so they're just like, basically, instead of like brains, it's sex. Among other horror themes, sex is prominent in 1979's Alien as well. The aliens hijack the human reproductive cycle with graphic imagery that mimics that of giving birth and seems to show the violation of the human body.
Yeah, it's like terrifying. And
Yeah,
awful.
the
pretty
blood,
rough.
the screaming, you know, these are all things we see during...
Mhm.
And then there's the long
tail.
going down her leg,
Leg.
kind of hanging out in the middle of, you know, where the
stuff
magic
is-
happens.
The stuff is.
Where sexual reproduction happens.
Yeah, exactly. Where sex happens, and
Yeah.
but yeah, it just feels very icky
Yes.
Yeah.
when you see that. It's very
It's-
no, thank you.
It's the
No.
same. It's the same thing. Where if you were shown a guy doing the same thing, like
Yeah.
unsolicited leg touching, right?
Mhm.
But this time it's a gross, awful
Right,
Yeah.
alien monster.
right, and it's
Yeah.
like both are bad.
Right. but that's the thing. It's like it gives you that same vibe,
Yeah.
even though this alien is
Not thinking of her in a sexual manner at all.
No.
right.
Yeah.
But it's still that same predatory
Yes,
thing.
it's that
Mhm.
predatory feeling. Yeah.
Yep.
In 1975, film changed forever when Steven Spielberg debuted the first summer blockbuster, Jaws.
It is as if God created the devil and gave him jaws.
Spielberg tapped into the sentiment that Hitchcock attempted with The Birds a little over 10 years before. Against man, nature is an unstoppable monster. He utilized the uneasiness and suspense, paired with John Williams' iconic score, just as Bernard Herrmann's Psycho theme helped make that film a masterpiece.
Oh, yeah. As somebody who has not seen Psycho, definitely know that music.
Mhm,
Yeah.
exactly. And anybody who hasn't even seen Jaws knows
Absolutely.
the music. Jaws was an important moment for horror because it brought it back to the mainstream. The film was high budget and showed that the genre was growing in popularity. A high budget horror movie
Can you
Yeah.
believe it?
that made a whole bunch of money.
Yeah.
It was another instance of American middle class life getting shredded.
Get shredded.
The horror of the 70s was a beautiful culmination of fears and concepts from the years before. Moviegoers were still dealing with the Cold War, with Vietnam, and the shock of Charles Manson, and the still developing concept of the serial killer, which were not called serial killers yet.
Mm-hmm.
So John Carpenter's masterpiece, Halloween, built on the films of the past while also forging ahead where no film had gone before.
This is another one with music that I recognize,
Mm.
despite not seeing the movie.
Very unsettling music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In an homage to Psycho, Carpenter cast Janet Leigh's daughter as the lead in his low-budget slasher film. It ended up being a breakout role for Jamie Lee Curtis, as she plays the timid virgin that fights her way to the end of the film. Halloween took the concepts of Psycho, premarital sex, masked killer, and even a similar score, and applied them to teenagers. Horror stories had been used to dissuade teens from having sex for generations, and here was an updated example. Oh my
Yes.
gosh, everyone's heard the hook-handed man story, right?
Yeah.
The story of the hook-handed man. The teenagers are out in the car in the middle of the night. Oh,
Yep.
gee, what were they doing out in the car in the middle of the night?
No.
When the hook-handed man appears, right? And leaves a
Yep.
hook on their window. I remember that story.
I'll get you, Peter.
I remember hearing that story, and my sister explained to me that story is to keep people from having sex. It's to scare people, teenagers, from being out alone at night together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, up on Makeout Mountain. Or whatever this.
Makeout Mountain.
Whatever their spots would be called. You know what
Yeah,
I'm
I
talking
mean,
about.
I get your
we know
sentiments.
what
Yeah,
you're
they're-
saying. We know what you're saying. Yeah. Carpenter later said he was punished for killing sexually promiscuous girls in the film. He's just building on the trope where a female character is promiscuous and then she dies. And this is a trope that got repeated
Yep.
time and time again. That's why they make fun of it in Scream,
Yes.
which we'll talk about someday,
Yes.
but not today. But in Scream, they say, don't have sex.
Yep.
You will die. Filmmaker John Carpenter said of the horror movie process, audiences don't want something too horrible. That's not entertaining for them. They want to be entertained. They want to have a good time. They don't mind some of the characters on the screen getting bumped off, even if in terrible ways. But you can cross a line, and the audience will turn against you. And if you're a filmmaker, you can sometimes use that to your benefit by teasing the audience. The audience will be like, God, are they going to show me something I don't want to see? It's great, because the audience provides most of the action for you in their heads.
Yeah. Brilliant.
I'm saying, man, imagination is the worst.
I heard that quote, and I was like, oh my God, I didn't know that they did this to me. I didn't know that
it was purposeful.
Yeah, because I was thinking about it last week. I'll go see a horror movie, and it's never as bad as I think it's going to be when I watch it.
Yeah.
And that's why. Because they know. They know that there's a line, and they know that when I'm watching it, they're like, there's something, there's somebody watching this right now, and we'll make them think that we're about to do something unspeakable.
Right.
And then we'll do something not as
Speakable.
bad.
Not quite.
Something
And
that
it
you
won't
can say.
seem, because their imagination has made it so much worse,
Mm-hmm.
it won't seem that bad.
Yeah.
By the end of the 1970s, zombie movies were still going strong. George Romero is often remembered for using his zombie to parody consumer culture. In 1978, he brought us Dawn of the Dead, a continuation in his zombie series that he would make several installments of throughout his career. And as we know, zombies would never die.
Ironic.
Yeah. Moving on to the 1980s now. The 1980s were a callback to traditional values. A new president, Reagan, came into office, and while many felt that his new policies would help the country, others felt like they were restrictions on freedoms. The horror movies of the 80s would address this by bringing horror into the normal, everyday suburban American life.
Like the 50s.
Yeah. Filmmakers would even be able to do this more convincingly as technology, animatronics, and liquid latex were improving special effects and visual effects. It would be a decade of excess of consumerism, horror, and Stephen King.
Yeah. I love how the 70s and 80s, looking at these, are just culminations of past decades.
Yes.
You know, like you hear the 80s, it's a decade of excess. You think of the 1920s.
Yep.
You know, and then of course there's a lot of 1950s that we're
Mhm.
gonna see here in the 80s, and in the 70s there was a lot of 50s stuff, and
Yeah.
you know, some stuff from the 20s and the 30s. So it's really interesting.
All compounds. Building off John Carpenter's Halloween, films like Friday the 13th continued to place teenagers in murderous situations. This film followed some of the same tropes that had been built and perpetuated in the 60s and 70s in regards to sex and horror. To further bring home the American ideal, it was quite popular to go after the Soviets as the Cold War neared its end after 40 years.
God.
Whew. Americans still clung to their dream of a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence, striving for the picturesque moments captured in Norman Rockwell paintings.
Still fighting for it.
Yeah, in
Clinging
ways.
onto
yeah.
it. The concept of something sinister lurking in the most unexpected of places certainly harkened back to the 1950s and 60s, and would explain why films like Little Shop of Horrors got remade at this time.
Yeah. I was writing about things lurking in the most unlikely of places, and I
Yeah.
immediately, it's like, that's the beginning of Little Shop of Horrors.
Yeah,
Which
literally.
came out in 1960 and got remade in the 1980s.
Oh my gosh.
Mhm.
Yes. This concept was also promoted in the film Poltergeist, even in its trailer.
The house looks just like the one next to it. And the one next to that. And the one next to that. A young couple live in it.
Give Ken a kiss.
You are so obnoxious.
With their 3 children.
In the trailer for Poltergeist, they're like, you know, picture this town, you know.
Yes.
Oh, it looks perfect, doesn't it? You know, like,
Idiot.
It's a
Things are
suburban.
gonna go wrong soon.
Because history repeats itself, there were plenty of horror remakes in the 1980s, but one of the most prominent was John Carpenter's The Thing in 1982. Carpenter said that the film was a bleak look into the future. He was inspired by communism and the fact that no one seemed to trust each other. This was true in the 50s, and it was true in the 80s.
yep.
There's an imposter among us.
Always.
Yes. Stephen King's novels and short stories lended themselves well to the cinema. In the 1980s, many filmmakers took advantage of these stories and brought them to the screen. Some of the most notable, of course, being The Shining, Creepshow, Cujo, Pet Sematary, and Firestarter. In the documentary Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, Mick Garris says, Stephen King is the horror version of Norman Rockwell. His characters live in your neighborhood.
Yes.
Well, then I'm gonna move away.
It's impossible to cover the amount that Stephen King has contributed to horror cinema, and we will talk about him more later. But it's important to note that these stories are still influencing movies and shows today. Perhaps Stranger Things?
Yeah.
If it feels like we're repeating ourselves when we draw parallels from the 50s to the 80s, it's because we are. Just like in the 50s, horror became a spectacle again, with horror camp films becoming cult classics and fun spectacles to enjoy with friends. It became clear that filmmakers could have fun with these films, and that horror could be lighthearted.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be a terrifying, traumatic experience.
Yeah.
It probably will be, but it doesn't have to be.
It just, it's speckled in there,
Yeah.
Right.
Some films walked the line of camp and horror, like Nightmare on Elm Street. One of the most iconic characters of the decade was Freddy Krueger, with his striped sweater, fedora, disfigured face, and hand with razors.
I mean, listen to that description. So over the top, so ridiculous. You think about it and you're like, okay, I can't believe, like this has to be camp. There's like a level of camp here. But it's still scary, because, this is jump scare, suspense, characters dying, characters that you care about dying.
Yes, absolutely. He would often have funny one-liners that would bring a little lightheartedness to the horrors that he was committing. In the documentary Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, Freddy is compared to FDR. Freddy kills the children of those that murdered him, bringing the punishment of the parents' sin down on the children. Franklin D. Roosevelt, during the arms race, brought debt onto the children of America.
Yeah, so it's interesting how you can see how these politics really played into the horror movies that came out later.
Yeah.
And the thoughts of these filmmakers and what they were having happen on screen.
The Evil Dead was meant to be a serious delve into the horror genre. It was edgy and excessive and ended up being cut by 49 seconds in the UK version for its obscene visuals. When it was released into the public, the over-the-top scenes, blood, etc. made the film comical, even though this was not the intent.
It still bothers me.
Yes.
That's the thing. I think it's funny that people find that comical. I watch it and I go, ooh.
Yeah. I mean, I watched it alone the first time, so I was definitely like, but I feel like maybe if you had a big group of people, it would become
I think so too.
more
I think it's
comical.
not really so much of a horror movie now.
Since the first Evil Dead had become seen as comical, Sam Raimi leaned into this and created Evil Dead 2.
My favorite thing about this is his attitude here.
Yes.
He made a serious horror movie, and he was like, this is serious, guys. And everybody was like, and so he was like, you know what? Fuck you. I'm going to make another one, and it's going to be stupidly ridiculous now. Because apparently, that's what I'm good at.
And he killed.
Yeah.
He went all out with shaky, moving cameras and over-the-top effects. If a normal amount of blood in a scene would call for 1 gallon, Raimi would insist on 10
Oh my
gallons.
god. That is ridiculous.
But it takes you out of it, and it doesn't feel real.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that kind of helps you not be so scared.
Mm-hmm. These films receive a lot of recognition, but a lot of horror camp stayed out of the mainstream. These were the movies that garnered cult followings and explains why the 1980s is synonymous with campy horror films. One of these was Killer Clowns from Outer Space. It's one that we, Robin and I at least, remember seeing as kids.
Nobody stores cotton candy like this.
What are you talking about? Of course it is. Look.
Yeah. It's actually funny. I see this movie get brought up on Twitter a lot.
Yeah.
Every time someone says, like, what was the first horror movie you watched, or what's the horror movie that made you fall in love with horror?
Yeah.
A lot of people name Killer Clowns from Outer Space. And I just want to say, yeah, it was a fundamental part of my childhood because I saw it one time, guys. Once. I think I was 11, maybe 10 or 11 years old.
It stuck with you.
I'm good. Like, I remember it. Like, I don't. It's so crazy to me because my sister, she's about 3.5 years younger than me, and it traumatized her.
Yeah.
And I just remember we saw it was like a summer day. Parents are gone. Brothers watching us. This movie's so ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way it'll scare you guys.
Yeah. They thought wrong.
Yeah. So, but that's the thing. My sister loves horror now.
Yeah.
And it's just so funny that like a movie like that can introduce you to horror when you're young, and then you can love it when you're an adult because of that experience that you had when you were a kid. So
I, as a kid, mostly just think I saw the scene where they're running around in the fun house. I mean, it's really the ship, I believe, but they're just like running away from these clowns, and that's like all I remember.
Yeah.
And so, horror camp of the 1980s is probably a good place to stop for now.
Yeah.
You know, before things get too scary. We'll get to the 1990s and beyond someday soon. But remember, history often repeats itself, as does horror. It's incredible to think that we can be afraid of the same things that people feared many years ago. Horror can transcend generations if it taps into the fears that make us human. Sometimes we don't find something as scary as we once did, and that type of horror will dip out of the mainstream, only to find its way back years later when old fear reignites. Our journey through horror film history will be stopping here for now, and at the end of the 1980s. Sure, there's a lot more to talk about, and a lot more to go back and dive into. In terms of the genre, we've just grazed the surface. The best way to learn about horror films is to watch them. So get out that remote, friends, and come back and see us soon.
Adam will be doing it too.
No.
Yes.
We're gonna be watching The Shining together.
No.
You can do it.
I'll be fine.
So I think this is another case closed. Yes. Woo. So.
Perfect.
I'm feeling energized again now.
Good.
Guys. All right, so you guys can find us, of course, on blackcasediaries.com. You can find our Instagram, our Facebook, if you like Facebook, and Twitter. Twitter's a big one. You can always send us a message. Always let us know what you're thinking. What was your favorite horror movie, or how were you introduced into horror? Tell us about it. We want to hear.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty great.
Yeah.
And we also have No Small Parts, our other show. BCG presents No Small Parts. It's on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you want to go, or Anchor. And we also link to it on our website, blackcasediaries.com.
Yep.
So please go check it out.
Yes. Thank you.
We'll see you later.
Goodbye.
Ha 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 ha!